Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the session. This is the second repeat of the session. If you weren't able to make it earlier this week, we are going to talk about design and architecting for greenfield deployment. We do have a upgrade session you might have attended earlier, but all of these are recorded. Use disclaimer, quick agendas. We'll just do some quick introductions. Then we're going to just talk a little bit about what's top of mind for organization and how you can actually help your organization modernize and really help them deliver on some of these IT outcomes that they're really ultimately struggling with. I'm going to talk about some of the VCF concepts, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sushil, who's going to cover some of the design options in VCF 9 and what's changed, especially if you might have been familiar with VCF 5.x, and then some of the different considerations you might want to think about as you select your different kind of deployment opportunities. Then I'll kind of come back and take you through a walkthrough of what it looks like to deploy a VCF 9 deployment, and hopefully you'll see that it's much more easier and more streamlined than prior versions of VCF.
Hello, my name is Sushil Suvarna. I've been with VMware/Broadcom for over 7 years now. I'm part of the solution architecture team. I lead a set of solution architectures for VCF. And I'm going to hand it over to my co-presenter, who's kind of new to this, so I'll let him take a few minutes introducing himself and get started.
I'm the new intern. My name is William Lam. I'm a distinguished engineer working for Broadcom, coming up on almost 15 years now. I have a personal blog, and you can feel free to reach out on a number of different social media platforms. Like Cecile mentioned, we're part of the solution architecture team within the VCF division. We have this whole design and architect explore series, and so if you're interested in checking out, I know we're already Wednesday, but these are going to be available as recorded. But if you're interested in other areas like modern applications, learning more about networking, we do have a whole series from within our colleagues team as well to be aware of. So what's kind of top of mind? When we talk to a lot of our customers, they kind of tell us right now today that many organizations are under pressure to do more with less, be able to move faster than ever, and doing so in a world where you're constantly under attack. And I think every one of you that's sitting in this room can lead and help your organization take charge in some of these areas. And there's sort of 3 pillars that we talk about in terms of some of the business priorities. Modernizing your infrastructure, bringing that standardization, consistency, and operational efficiency, not just from your primary data center, but all the way out into the edge. Once you've done that, you can then also modernize your applications and service delivery, not just your existing workloads, but what net new services can you bring to your organizations to enable net new generations of applications. You've probably heard a lot about AI this week. I'm sure you're probably tired of it, but it's kind of the wild, wild west right now. There's a lot of chaos happening there. People are trying out things, experimenting things. They have GPUs for different lines of businesses. They're all underutilized. They have these models. You might have heard of these large language models, hundreds of gigabytes. All the data scientists are excited to download these things, and just imagine what they're downloading from the internet. It's not efficient, and ultimately these resources are not well utilized. It kind of is analogous to what happened 20 years ago with server virtualization, right? Every line of business had their own systems. And then over time, we realized that there's a sprawl of infrastructure that then threw that back onto the IT infrastructure team. So I think here is a good time where you can kind of take a look at how do I modernize the existing ways of delivering workloads, including new processes, tooling, and automation that's built into these different platforms, but also what are the new capabilities, some of the data services that we had talked about earlier this week, networking services that you can really enable and really be that superhero within your organization, say, how can I help you, right? They really are struggling. They might not be saying it, but you'll see it as they're kind of experimenting with these different workloads. And then lastly, how can you ensure that you can help your security and compliance team, right? Stay secure, following those policies. How do you take these policies and governance and translate that into something that can be codified into the system using things like VCF automation so that you're not having to go approve a ticket, right? You can actually codify these things. Protecting your workloads, not just from disasters, but also ransomware attacks. It's a real serious situation for a lot of organizations. You don't hear a lot about that. But it is a big challenge that we're hearing directly from CIO level executives. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and really just talk about some of the new VCF 9 constructs, right? And just get everybody up to speed. How many of you are currently VCF customers today or have deployed it? Oh, fantastic. And I'm sure many of you are still kind of new, learning about what's in VCF, and so we wanna kind of give you this brain dump in terms of what that looks like. It really starts with understanding how do we deliver a modern private cloud. If you think about it, we haven't really changed that historically, right? If you look at where we started from, is we had infrastructure that we can run both in our primary data center, edge locations, even some of the managed service providers. And ultimately what VCF 9 is this consistent substrate infrastructure that lays across all of your foundational deployment models. And then on top of that, you as the infrastructure admin really is here to be able to manage and operate at scale, right? Delivering policies, multi-tenancy capabilities, right? And really just leveraging that software-defined construct. But how do you start to operate that at scale using VCF9? And ultimately, this is what we refer to building and operating a private cloud. And then once you've got this infrastructure, it's raw infrastructure. Now, you might have different lines of businesses if you're a traditional enterprise. You might be a service provider where you have different tenants or different organizations. And it's really up to these individuals, and you may be those individuals, by the way, is how do I take this raw infrastructure, the compute, the storage, all these rich services, and how would I slice and dice that and start to provide some governance, resource controls around that so I can actually deliver this as a service, similar to what you might see in the public cloud, but with the governance and policies of an enterprise. And here you're able to then take this raw infrastructure, slice that up, divide that logically, things like availability zones, regions, these are things that you've heard of, right? Sometimes these are manifested in different ways. You can actually codify that using our platform, right? And then taking that and exposing that to the different lines of businesses, configuring things like identity providers, right? And then ultimately, what is that enterprise catalog of services? Whether you're gonna build applications that they can request through a traditional service catalog to raw building blocks like network services, load balancing services, Kubernetes containers, where end users can then request that via the self-service mechanism, right? There's no right or wrong way. And ultimately, you want to deliver that experience not from one fixed user experience. You want to deliver that based on what they want, their native experience. For a developer, that might be an IDE, and they want to connect that to their CI/CD pipeline for continuous testing, where it automatically, as they check in code, it's automatically going to talk to the infrastructure, build out those components in a modern way, and then delivering an endpoint to them. For some traditional enterprises, it might be the self-service portal with a particular catalog, and I want to expose that to different lines of businesses based on the criticality, based on the requirements, right? So many different ways, all the way up to using APIs and even some of the desired state mechanism. Now, once we set that up, ultimately, this is really delivering it to the end users, right? You might be one of the end users, developers might be an end user, and maybe another organization that you want to provide. And ultimately, this is where we want to provide that unified modern consumption interface that I mentioned earlier, whether it's UI, API, Ansible, Terraform, maybe even being fronted in by something like a ServiceNow or some type of internal service catalog, right? And this is what we refer to as consuming that private cloud experience. The same experience that you might get if you go to the public cloud. And again, using VCF9, these are the core areas. This is really where VCF operations and all that functions I talked about, that fleet-wide management, and we'll talk a little bit about what are those capabilities in VCF9. And then from a consumption standpoint, this is our VCF automation component. So today, VCF operation plays a critical role in many of your organizations. How many of you deploy VCF ops today? Great, a lot of hands, right? And historically, when we think about operations, we typically talk about logging, monitoring, troubleshooting, capacity planning. But when you think about operation, that's just one sliver of what it means to actually operate at scale for a data center, right? And so we've also evolved VCF operations in 9.0 to really give you that fleet-wide capability, the single control plane for managing your entire fleet of infrastructure. And we'll talk about what that fleet looks like in a second, right? Unifying that, certainly lifecycle management becomes a big driver for us to really simplify that, and you'll see a lot of great enhancements, including things like live patching. In fact, one of the very first 9.0 patch that was released recently was a live patch. Now I can go into VCF operations, define that image, associate that with different vCenter servers, different clusters, and from one single pane of glass, I can actually roll that, plan out the patch, I can stage it, and then roll that out in one single interface, right? As you would expect for a operations platform. Once we've got inventory of that infrastructure, what else can we do? And you hear a lot about this fleet level management capability. So now we have password management, certificate management, tags, and again, allowing you to ultimately give that visibility and lifecycle these components that you can meet your password requirements, your certificate requirements. In fact, we've even taken that step further with certificate management. We've enhanced it, not just allowing you to set the policies, rotate them, but we've actually done it in a way where you do not have to have a service impact. So typically replacing a certificate, while can be challenging, the biggest challenge with it is actually the retrust. And so we've actually made these operations non-disruptive. A big part of it is also SSO, being able to use modern identity. So whether it's OAuth clients, SAML2, or even 80 over LDAP. So now you have true single sign-on across your entire stack using modern identity providers, whether it's Ping Federate, Okta, ADFS, Keycloak, right? These are all industry standards, and we just haven't had this one kind of unifying the platform. Now, nobody likes to talk about licensing. I certainly don't. But since we have this visibility in terms of all your infrastructure, you would imagine that that's an area that we can continue to innovate in on, right? And so we also have this new function within operation is it is now your central license management component, simplifying things. Now in VCF 9, unlike prior version, it is keyless entitlement, right? And so you'll connect that into the Broadcom support portal, whether it's connected or an air gap model, there is a model for that as well. And ultimately, it's gonna help manage your different licenses so that you don't need to go out and assign specific hosts, specific clusters, right? Based on your entitlements and based on how you want to divvy up your resources, operation can automatically consume that and manage that for you. Now, of course, we continue to have functions in terms of capacity management, security operations, all the things, right? But this is a complete comprehensive operations platform. And that's really the biggest change. If you've come from the world where I only use operations for things like logging capacity, it is now a management plane for your entire infrastructure. We'll go through each of these steps. We'll have a concept of a VCF domain, an instance, and a fleet, but just kind of keep this logically in terms of what the flow looks like. We start off with the core building blocks, right? Our software-defined components. So obviously, compute is our vSphere platform. So this is vCenter and ESXi host. Historically, if you look at VCF, we were very rigid. We kind of mandated vSAN, and that was the only primary storage option. And so in 9.0, we actually provide much more flexibility there. So in addition to vSAN, OSA, and ESA, we also support fiber channel VMFS, as well as NFS as external storage provider. So you do have a lot more choice, and this is sort of meeting the demands of our customers. Now, obviously, there's a lot of greatness that comes with vSAN, especially our ESA architecture, but you do have choice. Obviously, networking is our NSX solution, and this together is what we refer to as a VCF domain. And this becomes sort of your core building block. Now, there are two types of VCF domains here. We have a management domain, and there are a couple of new components that's introduced here for those of you that are not familiar with VCF. We have a VCF operations collector. This is responsible for collecting inventory metrics and providing that all the way back up into your operations platform. So now you're no longer having to send information from your ESX host to vCenter just to provide that right back into operations. So we've also streamlined those data paths as well as where we're storing that information so you have true visibility across your entire fleet. And then SCDC Manager is a new component. It's been there since 5.x, but it's responsible as a multi-vCenter, multi-cluster local control plane, right? So it's responsible for basically managing and lifecycling all the components that you saw earlier. Now, once I've stood up this initial primary management domain, and if you're like a vSphere customer, you might have like a management cluster, similar concept here. Now, after that, I can run workloads in this management domain, right? For those of you who might use VCF, you might have heard the term consolidated architecture. That term no longer exists. A lot of flexibility here, so I can run my management components. I can also run some workloads for environments that have smaller footprint. But for some organization, I want to have that separation. It might be for compliance, it might be for security, maybe for a number of different reasons. So I can deploy something called a VCF workload domain. Now, similar to what the name sounds like, it's for your workloads. But here you can see we're only deploying the core software-defined components. There's no additional collector, there's no additional SCDC manager, right? And what this means is that from a single management control plane, I can manage any number of these deployments within an instance. And this together, one VCF management domain, you may or may not have workload domains like I mentioned earlier, is what we call a VCF instance, so an instantiation of the platform. Now, earlier I mentioned operation plays a big role, right? So we're gonna add that additional component in here. So you have VCF operations. So now all that information flowing from each of these different domains goes up to the centralized VCF operations platform to deliver on those VCF fleet management capabilities that I talked about earlier. And then once we have all that, well, what else can we do with it, right? It's really taking this infrastructure, slicing that up, creating that multi-tenancy, those different organizations, the service catalogs that you probably heard about this week on VCF automation. And when we take this VCF instance with one deployment of operations, and this is a one-to-one mapping, so you see one operations and one automation, this is what we refer to as a VCF fleet. Now, in this example here, I have one VCF instance within the fleet, but I can also have multiple fleets. And Sushil will talk a little about some of the considerations in terms of why I might have multiple instances, operations, some consideration. But the key point here is that I truly have one single operations deployment, right, for my fleet scale. And then I can also take automation and slice that across the board. So depending on your use cases, level of isolation, you have a lot of flexibility here. And then if we take that a step further, I can have obviously multiple fleets. And so in each fleet, I will have a single operations and automation platform. But you can see that each of these are sort of isolated and from that nature, and there will be some considerations there as well. And then just as here's another view, again, logically as a recap, right? We have a single automation operations platform. So this is a one-to-one mapping. And a fleet is then comprised of one or more VCF instances. And a VCF instance is comprised of a VCF management domain, and it may or may not have workload domains. And again, similarly with a VCF private cloud, I can have multiple fleets. Now, before I hand it over to Sushil to talk about some of the design changes and options, I do want to mention just a little bit of terminology here around things like availability zone, which ultimately becomes a fault domain. And you can kind of see there are going to be some availability options, at a VCF instance as well as a fleet level, and then also region, which typically is a geographical separation. And we'll talk about what that means in terms of latency and bandwidth standpoint. So I'll have Sushil come up and talk about some of the new VCF design options.
VCF, more importantly VCF 9, was taking the best of the components that we had and offering an integrated platform that brings it all together. We took components like VCF operations, automation, components that you've already been familiar with, and enhanced them with newer capabilities while keeping what they did originally. So for example, with VCF operations, while it used to be a component that was mainly used for monitoring and troubleshooting, it now evolves into the layer of the private cloud that does manage and operate as well. So as we look at this evolution and the definition of the fleet, one of the things we want to emphasize in terms of designing your VCF 9 is how you think about availability and resiliency of your entire fleet. So now the fleet is a relatively new concept that we've introduced in 9, but as William said, it's basically a collection of the components that we've already had in our portfolio. So we'll talk about 3 different layers or levels of availability and resilience because the term HA or high availability can apply to multiple different scenarios. So the very first one is local protection, where you can choose to have your individual components configured in either simple or HA mode. And this gives you the ability to protect against local failures. So if it is a failure of a component on which, let's say, ops resides, that's all you can restrict it. You can move it to the backup that's there. The second layer of protection is to span across multiple availability zones with a configuration that will offer more high availability in an active-active config. And the third is to protect against disasters. So what we'll do is, because we'll be using the terms HA interchangeably, I just wanted to layer on the different levels of resiliency and availability that we'll be focusing on in a lot of the designs that I'll be going over. Right, so let's take a look at the very first design. What we've done is we've structured 4 specific designs for the new management domain that now also contains VCF operations and VCF automation. And we want you to decide which design fits best based on your actual requirements, right? These are best practices. You choose to implement any of them based on exactly what you want to do with your infrastructure. So the basic design is the one that we expect a lot of customers to get started when they move to VCF 9, where you stand up a fleet, you have one or many instances under that, but you only configure local protection for the management components in ops and automation. If you're doing a POC, you're just getting started, this would be something to start getting on board with. Now, let's start looking at the next evolution of what you can think about in terms of a design that offers a little more resilience. So in the second design, we're talking about the design that has site high availability that includes the configuration of stretch clusters under the covers. So this gives you protection against the failure of a single fault domain. So some examples of these failures are if you have a power outage, or you have a networking issue with one of your racks, you might be able to switch over to another management component that's in another AZ. The one requirement for this configuration is that you need at least 5 milliseconds of latency at most between the two AZs that you're configuring site high availability on. So for design number 3, we're going a little further, and here we're talking about what you need to think about if you're actually looking to protect your environment from disasters. So this is kind of the next layer of protection where you're actually configuring DR for your management components. So some of the use cases for this is, if you really want to protect your data centers from natural disasters, cyber attacks, or any major catastrophes, you would go ahead and configure DR for your fleet components so that they can recover in time in case of any major faults. The fourth design kind of brings a lot of it all together. So the fourth design is an aggregation of the site high availability as well as DR. So it's kind of like the best of everything, all brought together. So this includes a combination of the active-active configuration with stress clusters, which means you're protected in case an actual AZ goes down, and even if there is a disaster, you have protection against that as well. We have these 4 designs starting from the basic all the way to the one that has all the layers of protection. And just to summarize, from the basic design, we said it's something where you can get started, you can configure your appliances with local protection, and that's the only kind of failure you can protect against. You then move on to site high availability, where you can get protection against the failure of a fault domain. Moving on to DR, where you protect against disasters, and then finally the design where we bring all of this together. When we've spoken to a lot of customers about some of their thoughts, and we've tried to ask them how they think about these designs, a lot of them think that they might start, let's say, from the basic and progress on and move to more complex deployments. But one of the things that we want you to be mindful of is as you begin your VCF9 journey, you look at what exactly is your North Star, plan for that, and start building accordingly. I mean, we don't expect you to go all the way to the end, but you can decide what eventual level of resilience and availability you want and start planning your environment accordingly. The second thing is you can actually mix and match. So depending on how you structure your environment, how you structure your instances, and your fleets, and you could have more than one fleet, you can choose to have a different level of protection and design for your specific environment. So we give you that complete flexibility. What we have done in terms of the designs, we've actually gone ahead and documented all of these designs, and that's part of the 9.0 documentation itself. So we took each of these designs and added another one to it and created 5 specific blueprints that offers curated design options for what you need to be mindful of if you choose to implement any of these that I just spoke about. So a lot of this already exists in the documentation. After the sessions, you can always go back and take a look at them to get a feel for exactly what these designs are all about. All right, so now that we've spoken about the designs, let's talk a little bit about the additional design considerations that you should be mindful of as you start building VCF, with a big focus on the management domain. So like I said, Ops becomes a part of your primary management domain in the fleet. So there are 2 ways to actually deploy Ops, right? In terms of the networking, you can deploy it on the same management network as you have the rest of your management components. You can choose to do that. If you do that, of course, there'll be traffic sharing between all of the components. Or if you want to seclude the traffic of Ops from everything else, you also have the option of deploying it on a different VLAN or an NSX segment. In VCF9, we want to give you the flexibility of exactly how you want to build and deploy your environment, even though under the covers, we're bringing all of these components together. So now let's start looking at some of the limits that extend for an instance and then for a fleet, right? So when we are talking about an instance, there are some scale numbers for you to be mindful of. A single instance can have up to 25 vCenters. For ESX, you have 2,500 hosts. That's the maximum per VCF instance. And NSX managers is also 25. So some of the things for you to be mindful of as you build this cascading infrastructure that goes from instance to fleet to then private cloud. So once you've designed and understood the scale of the instance that you want to build, let's start thinking about exactly how you should now think about operations and scaling operations in this new world. So as we said, the new layer of our private cloud, that's kind of the central console for doing all operations, monitoring, and management, is VCF Ops. Now you can choose to have a single management component that spans across multiple instances under the covers, or you could splice it up any which way you want based on your requirements. So let's look at the different, some of the different decision points that you might want to consider before actually deciding whether one fleet is just good enough for you or you need more than one. So the very first component there is talking about scale. And just like anything, appliances have a limit to how much they can actually scale. So we have scale numbers for what a single ops instance can handle. I'll be going through that in the next slide. But scale is a determining factor for whether you want a single fleet or multiple fleet. The second consideration is latency. So operations, if you want to deploy it and have all of your infrastructure that's spread up across different regions, fold up to a single operations, there's once again a latency requirement for how far away these instances can actually be for ops to be able to manage. And the third is just organizational preference. It's purely up to you. You might not want to fold everything up into a single fleet, into a single ops. You might have dev test, you might have prod that are separated out. You might have different teams or organizations and you want to segregate access. You can then decide if you want one fleet or many under the covers to do this. Now, there is no actual limit for the number of instances that can be within an actual fleet, but these are the numbers, right? So we have a latency limit. You can have as many instances as you want under the covers. Go ahead and hook it up to VCF Ops for you to manage within your fleet, but it has to be within 100 milliseconds in terms of round trip. And when it comes to scale, which is a second factor, there are a few things to consider. If you have a single node deployment, then for the total number of objects, you can go up to 100,000 objects, or you can go up to 20 million metrics. If you have a multi-node deployment of ops, you can go up to 1 million objects overall with extra large, and you can go up to 126 million metrics. So a lot of how you design operations and your fleet, and in turn your VCF private cloud, depends on exactly how you want to scale your infrastructure and craft your environment under the covers. I'm going to hand it back to William, who will now go through a deployment walkthrough.
Thank you. So now you guys have a concept of the different constructs and why does it matter, some of the design considerations, and then ultimately the flexibility of these different architectures that you can actually go deploy. Let's make this a little bit more concrete for the audience here and actually go through an actual walkthrough. So first and foremost, having good deployment is really just having a good plan, making sure you plan for those things. Now, I do have to say this and repeat this again because we still have a lot of customers who might be leveraging existing hardware or might be looking at a new hardware purchase. Double check the Broadcom supportability list, right? Oftentimes, these things are constantly being updated. CPU vendors are constantly changing their updates, and in some cases, the supportability might actually be shrunk down, right? So always make sure that the hardware that you're using, whether you're repurposing the hardware itself or you're purchasing net new hardware, understand what is that longevity, right? When you start that project, you wouldn't want to install 9 and just realize that it's going to go into support. And it's not just the hardware, it's also the different components that you might find within the system itself. We talked a little bit about different deployment models. Again, if you're just getting started, whether it's a POC, development environment, you just want to get your hands really quickly, start with the basic design, right? We talked about this local protection. In VCF 5.x, you had to deploy a lot of these components in clustered mode. we've removed that restriction and give you that flexibility. So each of these components are just singleton, right? So it allows you to quickly stand it up without a whole lot of resources. In fact, we just had a breakout with Alan Renouf. We talked about what's the minimum amount of hardware footprint, obviously for non-production use cases, but you can see here, it's quite simple, right? And then ultimately, I need some VLANs, right? So it's, again, lowering the bar to get started. These are your typical management, vMotion. If you're using vSAN, obviously you want to have that dedicated or storage networking. And then obviously for the Edge and NSX TEP uplinks, so 5 to 6 VLANs at max, and you're able to deploy a full stack VCF9. And here's just a quick sort of mapping in terms of the IP addresses, in terms of how many you need for both the single or simple model, and then the clustered model. So again, trying to simplify it and allowing you to quickly deploy 9.0 to get started. After that, we have to prepare our ESX hosts. Right? These are the hosts that I'm going to start to provision my ESX installation. Obviously, all of you have installed ESX over the years. Next. You decide if you want to continue doing that or if you want to automate and install that, especially for scripted installations. For many of you, you can work with your OEMs to actually pull in those MAC addresses from the vendor. That's what I used to do as a customer. So once the hardware purchase has been put in, they can typically generate those MAC addresses and kind of send them to you early on. You can put in that into your DNS system, your DHCP reservation, so that once it's racked and stacked, powered up, you can remotely boot those images and you're off to the races, right? One thing to be aware is in 9.0, we also changed the evaluation period. Now, historically, for the past 20 years, we install ESX, you would have 60 days, right? And you have to either license it afterwards or you have to reinstall it. We've actually extended the evaluation period in 9.0, again, making it easier for you to try it out with now a 90-day evaluation period. Of course, you should license it as soon as you can, but there is some additional flexibility there. Now, once my host is set up, I do need to configure this new concept of a software depot. Now, the concept of a software depot is not new, right? You guys are patching via vCenter, you have software depot for your different environments, but one of the big changes here is that we've decoupled the installation installer with Cloud Builder with 5.x, which was this kind of monolithic virtual machine that would have the software binders. And every time we had a new release of VCF, you had to download this entire package. So we've actually decoupled that. So we have something called the VCF installer, which I'll talk about in a second. But there is this concept of a depot that has basically the software binaries, the vSAN metadata, the compatibility files, right? And these are going to get updated as we have new releases. Now, there are two ways in which you can retrieve this software. The first is going through an online model. So I deploy my installer, I generate a Broadcom download token, I put that into the VCF installer, it's connected to the internet either directly, hopefully not, or via some type of a network proxy, and it goes and downloads that software that's required to deploy your 9.0 deployment, as well as all the metadata files. So instead of having to go download the vSAN metadata separately, the compatibility file, it streamlines all of that for you. So that's something that you need to decide. And if you're doing a POC, you might choose the simple model, which is just connecting to the internet. But in practice, you might want to set up something called an offline depot. And here what you'll need is this new VCF download tool. And for those of you who use VCF, it's similar to the OBTU, which is this little utility that basically pulls down the software binaries as well as the metadata, but we've streamlined that. And the nice thing about this tool is that once you plug in that download token, it creates a directory structure for you, pulls down all the software, pulls down all the metadata file, and then that is now your offline depot. And I can take that directory and basically host it on a web server internally within your organization, and then I can serve that up. I can serve that up in one environment, or I can serve that up across multiple environments. And because it's HTTP, HTTPS, you can use a number of different technologies to ultimately replicate the software depot, and you would do the exact same thing that you would for any other repository. I was speaking with a customer earlier who runs a cruise line, and they have over 5,700 plus deployments across the fleet. These things are gonna be coming in and out of the port, and so what they'll do is they'll be able to replicate that immediately. In some cases, you might wanna just do it on like a USB key because they're not in port for that long, right? So this allows you to basically not only deploy a new fleet, but also extend it. Now, next up, I talked about a little about the VCF installer. This is that new installation utility. It's a graphical interface. We continue to have APIs, but it's really easy to use because it allows you to step through the flows, go through the different deployment models that Sushil mentioned. And the really nice thing about it is at the end of the flow, before you click go to deploy, I can actually export the JSON configuration file. So I can actually use the UI, go through so many different scenarios, whether it's singleton model, high availability model. In fact, one of the things that we don't have in the UI that is possible through this JSON mechanism is I can pick and choose the local protection for each of these appliances. So for example, I might want to have a single NSX manager, but I want to have a highly available VCF automation. While the UI does not allow you to do that, I can export the JSON, augment the JSON file, and then put that right back into the installer. And that's officially supported. But it gives you that greater flexibility, right? And with the JSON, I now don't have to go and enter all that information up front. And if I pre-do my DNS configuration, I can actually populate that, and I can source control that configuration file, load that back into the installer. And one big change that we did from prior versions of VCF 5.x is that when I load this JSON file, it doesn't just go and starts the deployment. I can actually edit that in the wizard, so you can actually see all that information pre-populate the UI, so you can kind of step through that. And once you go through this for the very first time, you'll realize that it's super easy to get started, and then you'll most likely deploy using the JSON mechanism or simply just using an API, and we have Terraform and PowerShell commandlets to instantiate your deployment of the fleet. Once that's deployed, obviously we talked about the software depot. So again, you can use the online depot. That's the easiest way to get started. I plug in my download token, pulls down the software downloads, the metadata, or it's going to connect to your internal offline depot, right? So for air gap, security compliances, but in general, you probably don't want to keep pulling downloads from the internet each and every single time that you're downloading it. So like I said, in practice, it makes sense to set up that depot and then keep that in sync. Here's the UI installer quickly again. It's not only used for the initial deployment, but it's also a workflow for extending your fleet. So once I've got my initial VCF fleet, I can easily add additional instances or fleets using the same installer. Now, while this session is specifically focusing on greenfield deployments, we do also have an upgrade session, and it actually uses the exact same installer. So again, the workflows have been simplified. All the experiences that I talked about in the VCF installer applies to also upgrade. So if I've got an existing vSphere environment, and I don't have operations, it'll go and deploy that component. If I have operations, you can say, I've got operations, I populate the parameters, and then it's gonna ask you for only the additional net new components. So again, not an upgrade session, but we do cover that in the other breakout if you're interested in here, that same installer. And then again, you can export that JSON for future uses, and it just makes it easier to redeploy once you're ready to take this to production. Now, once the deployment is done, like I mentioned earlier, we have this 90-day extended evaluation period. Now, you do need to have a valid VCF subscription, right, to entitle the system. One of the big changes from a licensing standpoint is that we simplify it, right, so you can now manage it fleet-wide, but it is no longer a sort of typical past perpetual license key. It's a keyless entitlement. And what that means is that the entitlements that you have within the Broadcom business portal, you can continue to slice and dice that based on different requirements. It might be like organizational purposes, maybe it's for financial accounting. And once you do that, you connect your VCF operations to that platform, and then it'll automatically get your entitlements, and based on how you register your operations. So like Shashil said, you might have one single operations for your entire estate, or you might have multiple operations instances. You would then register all of those operations instances into the Broadcom support portal, and based on how you want to slice and dice your licensing, it will consume that automatically for you. And similarly to the software depot, you have both a connected scenario as well as a disconnected, so basically for air gap. And I know that we do have customers in sort of the mission critical infrastructure, so there is sort of a third option. So talk to your account team if you're interested in that particular model. But in the connected state, obviously I'm connecting my operations directly into your entitlement system, hopefully through a network proxy, but you do have a disconnected state. And that flow looks something like this. After I install the product, I have 90 days, right? Everything works fine. Now, you're gonna have to then export the usage file from operations and take that file and upload that manually into the business support portal. Now, it can be done manually. We also have APIs, by the way. So you can totally streamline this process. Once you put that into the system, we're basically gonna say, this is your infrastructure at this point in time. Here's your current entitlements. We're gonna generate you a usage file. This usage file can then be placed back into operations, and your entire system is fully entitled. You don't need to do anything after that. Now, we do this for up to 180 days. So once you do that initial connection, whether it's connected or air-gapped, right, you have 180 days before you need to repeat that again. So in the worst case scenario, if you start at the beginning of the year, you need to do it 2 times a year. Now, you can always update this as frequently as you want, right? So there's no limits in terms of how frequently you're updating this entitlement as you add new capacity, whether it's new entitlements or new host capacity, right? And so if you have a certain amount of capacity that you purchased and you're getting close to that, right, you may want to basically update that usage file. So again, the connected state will be the easiest. There's nothing you need to do, but from a air gap, disconnected scenario, there are a few more steps, but we do have APIs and automation for that purpose. And then after that is deployed, you've got a full private cloud fully taken away. Now, just really quick takeaways for here, hopefully you'll gather is that, you might have experienced VCF in the early days. It was a very rigid system. It was very difficult to get some of these flexibility. And hopefully what you saw here is a lot more flexibility in terms of what the architecture allows. And what Sushil covers, all these different design options, right? We want to make it easy for you to start small, reducing the amount of minimal footprint so that you can really get the experience of a full private cloud. And again, using these curated blueprints from the solution architecture team. And we spoke with a lot of customers, including yourselves, and to understand where you're currently at today. I know many of you are still vSphere customers, and understanding what are the topologies, what are the components, and really building the product based on what you have today. So these blueprints is really a curation of what you have today and how best to design this to meet some of the needs of your business in terms of availability, organizational structure. Right, so really lean into these things. And again, these are part of the documentation. Historically, a lot of these best practices might have been white papers. They might have been outside of the download portal. This was built in conjunction with the product teams. And if you have feedback on these design blueprints, we're constantly updating them. So if you have new use cases that you don't see in there, let us know, right? And like I said, to get started, use a simple design, right? No local protection. And the nice thing about this is you can evolve each of these architecture and go from small to highly available. And again, like Sushil said, I can mix and match these different designs, right? So hopefully you get a sense that, VCF9 really delivers a lot of great possibilities, but it's also really easy to get started. And the steps that I walk you through is literally the steps that you would do today. And in just a couple of hours time, you have a full VCF9 fully deployed with all the capabilities that I'm sure you've heard about this week. So with that, I'll put the slide again if you want to check out some of the other sessions or at least for recordings. Really appreciate it. If you have any questions, we can hang around for some questions, but really appreciate it and thank you for your time.